For more than 11 agonizing days, every headline, every broadcast, every whispered prayer carried one name: Gus Lamont. A bright-eyed, curious 4-year-old who vanished from his family's sprawling property in the heart of South Australia's wild, unforgiving outback. One moment, he was chasing his dog near the shed. The next, gone. No sound, no footprints, no explanation. Within hours, the silence of the desert was shattered by the whir of helicopters, the calls of volunteers, and the heartbeat of a nation desperate for answers. Men and women, strangers and neighbors, walked shoulder to shoulder beneath a burning sun, driven by hope, by love, by faith that somewhere, somehow, Gus was waiting to be found. For 11 days, Australia searched. For 11 days, parents held their children closer. And for 11 days, the Lamont family became a symbol of heartbreak, unity, and unanswered prayers. But now, everything has changed. Because according to a new insider, someone who knows the family, someone who's seen what others weren't meant to see, the story we've been told might not be the truth at all. They claim the search was never what it seemed. That behind the tears, behind the headlines, behind the desperate appeals for help, was something far darker. And if what they're saying is true, then Australia wasn't searching for a missing boy, it was mourning a secret. Because according to those closest to the Lamont family, Gus Lamont was never lost. It was a normal evening. Or at least, everyone assumed so. The story of Gus Lamont isn't over, and the next piece of evidence could change everything. So before this video disappears from your feed, hit subscribe, tap the bell, share it. Let's make sure the truth reaches every corner of Australia, because silence helps no one. The 27th of September 2025. The Lamont family's remote sheep station sat deep in the South Australian outback, far from any town, blanketed in red dust and quiet stretches of land. Around 5 p.m., Gus was seen playing near a mound of dirt just outside the home, watched over by his grandmother. According to reports, about 30 minutes later, when she called him in, he was gone. Panic erupted almost immediately. The family searched for hours before notifying police. In the days that followed, authorities launched what became one of South Australia's most expansive ground and air searches. Helicopters, drones, heat sensors, mounted units, trackers, community volunteers, all mobilized across rugged terrain. Over those first 10 days, search teams covered a massive area, up to 470 square kilometers, yet tangible evidence remained elusive. No conclusive footprints past the first fence, no scent trail for dogs to follow, no clothing or personal item left behind. Yet officials maintained that Gus may have traveled further than expected, prompting the expansion of the search radius. This widening search came with contradictions. One tracker claimed he saw anomalous tire marks early on, later reported wiped or filled in. A child's toy listed as evidence vanished from official logs. Locals asked about road cameras, only to be told footage was corrupted. Volunteers later described the scene as searching for a ghost in red dust, as though the land swallowed every clue before it ever surfaced. And as the 10th day passed with nothing conclusive, whispers began. Had Gus truly wandered off, or had something far more sinister masked the truth? By day 5, the carefully constructed narrative began to crack. A seasoned volunteer, a bushman who had walked these lands for decades, spoke in hushed tones to reporters. "There's no way that boy's on this property," he said. "He knew every ridge, every dry creek, every hollowed log. If he were out here, we'd have found him already, or at least found something." That statement rippled through the volunteer ranks, because this was not uncharted territory to them. Many had hunted missing livestock, tracked lost hikers, but this search defied every rule they'd ever trusted. Then came the first red flag. A local journalist reported that drone footage from early in the search had been misplaced. When she returned the next morning to follow up, the data was gone. No backups, no logs, no trail. More troubling still, one volunteer claimed he overheard field commanders telling teams to avoid certain sectors in afternoon heat, even though those zones were still within the original search grid. When asked why, he said, "It was just protocol," but refused to elaborate. The silences followed. Witnesses who had first spoken openly to local media began retracting statements. Voices that had urged further scrutiny suddenly went quiet. Volunteers were explicitly instructed not to speak to press. And when one man refused to stay silent, kept asking tough questions, he was quietly warned, "Stay out of it." Meanwhile, contradictions began multiplying. A small footprint was initially flagged near a dam, but it was later dismissed by officials as unrelated. Yet locals claimed they saw that same footprint near a dry creek, then watched as either heavy trucks or earth movers seemed to alter the ground the next day. Few residents reported unusual car movements on the access roads at odd hours, but when police canvassed those roads, CCTV or drone records in those windows were missing or corrupted. Some began to whisper about gaps in time, lapses during the night, when search logs showed no activity, but volunteers claimed they still heard distant engines, possibly drones, passing overhead. By day 7, speculation had turned into skepticism. If a boy could slip so completely off the grid in a familiar property, then what had really happened? By the time search efforts entered a second week, the official story was fraying at the edges. It was on October 3, 2025, 6 days after Gus vanished, that authorities scaled back the search. The case was shifted from a full-blown search to a more static investigation under the Missing Persons Investigations section. Even then, police emphasized there was no evidence of foul play at that time. But near the edges of the public narrative, a new presence emerged, an insider voice claiming to know the family and hinting at a darker reality behind the disappearance. She described the anguish of those closest to Gus, but said it ran deeper than missing child grief. "They're hurting beyond belief," she whispered, "but not for the reasons we think." According to her, multiple events over those days didn't align with the wandered-off explanation. She claimed evidence vanished overnight, not just lost in the dust, but actively erased. She hinted that some witnesses were silenced, either by fear or pressure, before they could press harder. She insisted that the elaborate search spectacle, helicopters, tearful appeals, media coverage, may have served as a distraction from key internal movements made behind the scenes. In the public domain, a recent account from a former SES volunteer, Jason O'Connell, gave a voice to one of those cracks in the facade. He claimed that despite spending over 90 hours combing Oak Park Station, he encountered zero evidence that Gus was ever on the property. He emphasized that if Gus had truly traversed that land, there would have been multiple physical traces, footprints, scuff marks, signs of passage. Then came the footprint controversy. One footprint was initially touted as the only tangible clue, but on the 7th of October, police publicly stated that the footprint was unrelated to Gus's disappearance. This triggered intense speculation. Was it a decoy, a planted artifact, or simply a mistake? Additionally, misinformation began swirling. Fake AI-generated images, purportedly showing Gus abducted from the site, circulated online. Authorities publicly refuted their authenticity. One short article clarified that a family friend appearing in certain viral images was falsely portrayed. Taken together, a volunteer says there's no trace of Gus on the property. The key footprint is dismissed by authorities. Footage is misplaced. Voices go silent, and an insider says the truth is being hidden. If she's right, that the search was more spectacle than substance, then we must ask, what was being concealed? And who had the power, in those early hours, to shift the record? As the official search wound down, the questions only grew louder. By October 7, 2025, the South Australia Police confirmed what many feared. After 10 relentless days, no trace of 4-year-old Gus Lamont had been found. Not a footprint, not a fiber, not a clue. The search, they said, would be scaled back. But outside the official channels, a different story was taking shape. Several SES volunteers privately claimed that key logs and reports had vanished from internal databases. Hours of drone recordings, early GPS tracks, even segments of the volunteer coordination sheets. Authorities later described it as a data syncing issue, yet no one could explain why the gaps lined up precisely with the first 2 days of the search. And then came the satellite mystery. Media outlets noted that aerial images of the Lamont property from the evening of September 28, the day after Gus disappeared, were suddenly withheld from public view under privacy provisions. To some, that was reasonable protocol. To others, it was another brick in a growing wall of silence. Meanwhile, the so-called footprint that had once ignited national hope was now officially dismissed. Police insisted it belonged to a searcher, but some in the SES weren't convinced. One volunteer swore that he'd seen it hours before crews reached that area. If that's true, it means the first and only possible trace of Gus was erased, not by nature, but by oversight. As media attention intensified, the family's communications became tightly controlled. Requests for comment were funneled through intermediaries. Interviews were canceled. And yet, online, theories multiplied, some compassionate, others cruel. Authorities pleaded for restraint, warning that speculation was hampering the investigation. But the tone of official statements told its own story. Detective Superintendent Debray said bluntly, "There is no evidence to indicate foul play, but we have not ruled out any possibility." It was a subtle shift, the kind of phrasing that suggests something unspoken, unfinished, unresolved. And that's when whispers of a cover-up began to crystallize. Because if a massive multi-agency search could leave behind no trace, no data, and no closure, then perhaps the real story wasn't buried in the outback soil, but hidden within the files that disappeared before anyone could read them. If you look back through the timeline, the vanishing footage, the silenced witnesses, the footprints that suddenly meant nothing, a disturbing possibility begins to emerge. Maybe Gus was never lost in the way we assumed. If what insiders claim is true, then much of the official narrative may have been constructed, not to find him, but to contain something far more unsettling. The cover-up theory. What if the search operation, with its helicopters, volunteers, press conferences, was intended not to locate Gus, but to manage perception? Every drone sweep, every dramatic shot on newsfeed, every tearful appeal might have served as a collective smokescreen. What if the disappearance itself was an internal event, an accident, a confrontation, a tragedy, and the wandered-off story was deployed to redirect scrutiny? What if some evidence was deliberately erased, footage, logs, satellite images, to prevent a truth more painful than a missing child from surfacing? What if the people closest to Gus had no choice but compliance, to protect a name, a legacy, or something no one was ready to face? These are not accusations, they are questions. Yet the gaps in the record, the contradictions, the fresh claims from insiders, they demand examination. Reflection, the heart of the mystery. We began this journey thinking we'd tell the story of a missing boy. But now, maybe the deeper question is who lost the truth? A nation's search turned into a national vigil. A family's pain became public spectacle. And in the silence between the statements, the most troubling possibility lingers. That what we saw was not the search for a missing child, but the performance of a hidden grief. If Gus was never lost in the way we believed, then what we mourned was something else entirely. If you believe the truth deserves a voice, hit subscribe, tap the bell, and share this story before it disappears again. Because somewhere out there, someone still knows what really happened to Gus Lamont. And the closer we look, the harder it becomes to hide the truth.